anyway, I'll start with the first one. I think the insight is that people do judge a book by its cover. And, well, you know, I was...
you know what? So that's your insight. We'll come to the story after that.
Okay, fine.
All right.
So just say the insight.
Just the insight.
Okay, cool.
My insight, it's in long words, but essentially I'll just say it in one line. People used to talk about competition increasing. I think the opposite. Dominance is increasing in business, in niches, and in sectors, and it's all about dominance.
Right. Your second insight, Ashwin.
So my second insight stems from the book I wrote, which is that 99% is good luck, and the remaining 1% is bloody good luck.
All right. Your second.
My second insight in terms of dominance in the market is a strange one. It says the most dominant brands are the ones that spend the least on advertising and marketing. So I know Sam would disagree with that, but it's good fun. I've always disagreed with him in public.
Right. Third insight, Ashwin, go ahead.
My third insight is that an effective lie, and since we were speaking about honesty and dishonesty in the previous session, an effective lie is one that stays as close to the truth as possible.
Ooh. All right. Mahesh.
My third insight that the secret to life, success, and everything on earth is to be remark-worthy. That's what creates big businesses, being remark-worthy.
All right. So we have the three insights each. Now we start with the second segment, which is stories behind the insights. Your first insight and the story.
Sure. I must tell you, when I had just started out as a writer, that was in the year 2004, and at that point of time, I knew very little in terms of the retail trade. I probably am the most rejected author in the world. I don't think the Guinness Book of World Records has included me as yet, but probably I deserve to be there because I was rejected by 47 publishers and agents.
I think J.K. Rowling was 36 or something.
Yeah, so that used to give me a little bit of an upper, that I was a little more than her.
Even more rejected then.
But the reality is that we are living in a world where it's so difficult to tell a story. More importantly, we are living in a world of declining attention spans. So, for example, a recent study, Mahesh, you would probably be aware of this. They did a study in bookshops, and they found that the average buyer in a bookstore spends 8 seconds on the front cover and 15 seconds on the back cover before he or she decides to pick up a book. That's 23 seconds. I still remember that scene from the Shah Rukh Khan movie where he said, "Ye 70 minute." Those are the life-changing 70 minutes. This is 23 seconds. In 23 seconds, it's decided as to whether that book will go to the cash register or not. And just think about it. It's daunting. The total universe of books is 129 million, according to Google. About 2.5 million books are added every year. In India, we release about 82,000 books every year. Of that, about roughly 24,000 are English. Only 2 to 3% will land up at Crossword or Landmark or what have you. So the point is, how are you going to get noticed? And how is that decision going to be made as to whether you are worth reading and buying? An even more scary related statistic is the fact that those who do buy the book only land up to page 18. They don't go beyond page 18. 18 is the average number of pages of a book that are read. So given that sort of declining attention span, to my mind, those publishers who say that, listen, the book cover is not important. Ultimately, good writing will sell. No, that's a lie. That's a blatant lie. And frankly speaking, the statistics seem to indicate that. In the year 2000, when they looked at the human attention span, they found that the average human attention span was about 12 seconds. By 2013, that had declined to 8 seconds. And as of today, I think the goldfish has a 9-second attention span, which means that we writers should start writing for goldfish. Okay. So to sum up, I would say this, that it was and it's attributed to Hemingway, but we may take it as attributed to Hemingway or not. He said, write when you're drunk and edit when you're sober. I say that, listen, write when you're drunk, edit when you're sober, do it whatever way you want. Just remember that actually selling that book is the hangover. That's it.
A slightly related or unrelated set of circumstances. I grew up as a marketer in the 80s and the 90s where it was commonly believed that, you take something like cars or you take cement or you take pharma, and even today, or you take fashion, you have millions, hundreds and thousands of brands. And, within cars itself, if you say, gasoline-powered cars, there's Volkswagen Group, which is Volkswagen, Porsche, Audi, Bentley, etc., which is just a hair smaller than, maybe 0.4% smaller than the Toyota group of companies. And, if one is 20.4% and one is 20.1%, the General Motors is at 19.5%. So all the, in any market, the big companies are very closely bunched together. In pharma, I don't think any company is more than 10% of the world. They're all 9, 9.2, 7.8, 8 point, and so on and so forth. So I kind of grew up in this world that believed that competition is increasing, right? And which means, obviously, logically, if you follow it, if competition increases, it means all the big companies must be closely bunched up close to each other. But something strange has happened lately, right? If I take the modern equivalents of these companies. So in soft drinks, there's Coke and Pepsi neck and neck, and there's like Sprite and 7-Up and everything else. But if I take the modern equivalent of brands that have grown up in the digital era, one brand in the energy drinks space, Red Bull has 49% market share. Instead of cars, where they're like 8, 19, 20, 20.5%, if I take luxury electric cars, one brand, Tesla, has 99.2% market share. If I take the jumbled world of women's fashion brands, today one brand, Zara, is 10 times larger than Calvin Klein, $22 billion in sales. If I take the rag and tag world of coffee shops, today one brand, Starbucks, has 70% of the organized market globally. If I come to digital, it's even more crazy. If I take mobile chat, WhatsApp has a 70% global market share. Next guy, WeChat, is about 19%. If I take social networking, Facebook has 85% market share. If I take video, YouTube has 90% market share, to the point where it's crazy, right? We can name 10 India pharmaceutical companies. I bet you can't name the number 2 video platform after YouTube. You can't name it. Globally, we can name 10 India pharma companies. You can't name the number 3 search engine in the world. Because number 1 is Google with 91% market share. Number 2 is Bing with 4%, and you can't name number 3. You can't. So essentially, we used to grow up in a world where it was normally believed that, toothpaste mein Ciba ka hoga, Bina ka hoga, Colgate hoga. Essentially, maybe because of this declining attention span, or the breadth of product range, in any category, we remember 1 or 2 names. And I'll probably even apply it to that. So if you take that category of fiction in India where the title of the book is something to do with a number, there's Chetan Bhagat, right? There's 90% market share with 5, 4, whatever it is. In the category that Ashwin writes, he's a dominant leader. And that's it. We have really very, very little space for people. So if once there were 7, 8, 9, winners possible, now in a space, a particularly niche-defined space is 1 or 2. I mean, imagine Twitter has 100% market share. There is not competition to Twitter globally, right? Google search, Gmail, you take anything that you use, any app in your phone is probably a 90% market share leader. Why is it important to me? I invest in startups, I invest in companies, right? I want to end up with a company that wins. Once upon a time, I could be number 5. In fact, the number 10 pharma guy in India is probably worth 1,000 crores. But the number 3 search engine in the world is a pauper. The number 3, video platform in the world is broke. So today you have got to be number 1, or you've got to be number 2, or you don't exist. That was my learning that has really happened over the last couple of years.
I think I read about this in a book called The Blockbuster Effect.
Yep.
Was that the book's title?
I haven't read that, but
which seems to indicate that winner takes all.
Yeah, it is winner takes
pretty
all.
much. Okay, so I'll get into my second insight, which is that regarding luck. And I think it was a French actor, Jean Cocteau, who said, we have to believe in luck, because otherwise, how do we really explain the success of those whom we don't like? So, assuming that we do believe in luck, let me give you the story. which is that in 2003, I started writing that first book of mine. It was called The Rosabal Line. And by 2005, I had actually completed that manuscript, not having written anything before that. In fact, Mahesh knows me from a different avatar.
Absolutely.
As a businessman, more than as a writer. So I started applying, and of course, as I already mentioned, I had a ton of rejections, 47 in all. In front of my desk, I had a big bulletin board which indicated something like J.K. Rowling 12, and Stephen King 30, and Gone with the Wind 38. And those numbers were the number of rejections that had happened for those authors or for those books. And that is what then kept me going. One evening, my father had this wonderful Punjabi friend, and he used to come and enjoy a Patiala peg with my dad. For those who are uninitiated, a Patiala peg is 3 fingers. And so they were sitting.
Vertically. Vertically.
Vertically. So they were sitting and enjoying their drink, and this gentleman said, Beta, what's the matter? You're looking so upset. I said, well, you know, I mean, the entire world has already rejected me. So he said, kya problem hai? Ek do aur ko apply kar lo. You know, almost like it will get done. So I said, but there is no publisher left who wishes to review my work. So he said, Beta, just remember one thing in life, 99% is about good luck. So I said, but uncle, the 1%, what is that 1%? It must be time management, networking, hard work, talent. He said, nothing doing. 1%, that's called bloody good luck. And I don't know, this stuck with me. I said, my God, here is a man who's attributing almost everything to this factor that we call luck. Well, I must tell you one thing, that when I started writing that first book, I spoke to a friend who was already a writer, and I said, I have no training in writing, so do you have any suggestions? And she turned around and told me, Ashwin, it was the great novelist Somerset Maugham who said that there are 3 rules for writing a novel. Unfortunately, no one knows what they are. So that's precisely where you are, and that's precisely where every other writer is. And that defining line between success and failure, that defining line is so difficult to predict. And that's precisely what novel writing is all about. That you can't say what made it a success. And that happens with pretty much everything in our lives. We want to attribute reasons later on to say, oh, I did this right, or I did that wrong. But frankly, the one thing that we know is that we don't know. So that's really where I'm coming from. I'm sure all of you have experienced it at some point of time. And, well, yeah, so I'll end there.
So it's interesting. So Ashwin's the businessman turned writer, and in some ways I'm the writer turned somewhat businessman investor. So I started my life in advertising as a copywriter. So I came down to this. You know, I said, okay, there's all these companies, there's enormous, dominant, winning companies that are getting formed. And the reason I was interested is, you know, I suddenly am an investor. I manage my money. I manage a bunch of other people's money who tell me go invest in startups. So I've got to invest in winning companies. I got my MBA in investing by starting to invest my own money in 99 and losing a lot of it. So that's really what motivated me to say, okay, so what makes these companies successful? So the really interesting thing is I looked at all these companies we talked about. We talked about Zara. We talked about Red Bull. We talked about Starbucks. We talked about Google, Gmail, WhatsApp, YouTube, and so on and so forth. And I'm an advertising and marketing man. I started, at the age of 17 writing ads. And the really interesting thing I found among all these brands is that they've never advertised. Right? Google doesn't advertise. Zara doesn't advertise. Red Bull doesn't advertise. Starbucks doesn't advertise. Twitter doesn't advertise. WhatsApp doesn't advertise. Gmail doesn't advertise. Facebook doesn't advertise. Not one leading brand, in the world today. It's the losers who advertise and the winners who don't. So this actually blew me away because I'd say, I grew up believing that you've got to spend lots of money to advertise and win. And increasingly, the winners in every sector are the ones who spend nothing. So I said, that's really interesting. Let me try it with my own companies. So one of my companies was Redbus. Some of you may have heard it. It's a bus ticketing company. Every year, Funny would come to me and sit at the board and say, you know, boss, we need so much money to advertise. I'd make it zero. I'd say, go back. And he had no choice but to improve his product. And finally, in the end, we sold the company for, you know, when it was doing revenues worth about 900 crores. We'd built a middle-class e-commerce, 500 rupee per transaction company on no advertising. Right? We did the same with Carvale, no advertising. If you guys have been to Dulali, the bar out here, and in Andheri, and now coming up, no advertising. So essentially, it's really strange for an advertising guy to come to the notion that what causes you to win is actually, and what causes you to win the market is a lack of advertising. The less you advertise, the more you win. In fact, every time I open the paper and see, you know, another full-page ad to Arnab's employer, Bennett Coleman and Company of the Times of India, I say, to band hone wala company. Right? So it's not really nice news, but that's the incredible news. Look at, there's a great test of it. Take out your phone and look at any app you've used in the last 1 month on your phone. I bet it's an app that was never advertised. And look at anything that you've downloaded because of an advertisement onto your phone. I bet you've never used it. All right? So you look at it, and there is something really there to say where the world's biggest brands, and these are all billion-dollar brands we're talking about, are the ones that may have marketed but never advertised. So that really was my second kind of Hosanna moment, saying, okay, I don't need those big budgets. I don't need to give Sam and, you know, a few hundred crores to go make the brand. I think there's an easier way and a smarter way, and I'll come to that in my next insight. Thanks.
Cool. Actually, I never thought about this, Mahesh. But frankly, I mean, it's just blown me away, because when you mentioned all those specific names, you need to really think about this, and it's like almost counterintuitive.
Yeah.
So let me go to my third insight, which is that an effective lie is one that stays as close to the truth as possible. You know, the other day I was at a press conference a couple of months ago, and one of the gentlemen out there, he asked me, he said, you know, Ashwin, you are a Bania businessman, and suddenly one day you decided to start writing. And what is your qualification for writing? So I said, you know, during my growing up years, my mother used to tell me that I was a bloody good liar. And I could lie with a straight face. And I said, that is precisely the qualification that I bring to the table, that I can tell a lie, which is what all fiction writers have to do. So having said that, it also opened up a new line of inquiry in terms of the sort of books that I would be writing. And that's the reason I wanted to throw this in to the mix. 2 or 3 years ago, I was in Kolkata for a student lecture, and I had a few hours to spare in the afternoon. So I told the driver, I said, listen, take me to some interesting place. And he said, sir, would you like to go to a temple? So I said, sure, let's go. So we went there, and it was an extremely unassuming temple. In fact, from outside, it was difficult to imagine that it was a temple. We walked in, simple, plain white walls, and then in the middle of the room, right in the center, is a green-colored throne. And there was a Pujari ji who was doing Aarti at that particular point of time. And on the throne was a portrait of Amitabh Bachchan. And I thought that I have gone into some sort of a time warp. You know, is this real? I pinched myself, walked out. There was a little boy on the street corner selling small prayer books. I bought one from him. It was called the Amitabh Chalisa. It's still very lovingly preserved amongst my collection. But I thought to myself, I said, isn't this, let's imagine for a minute that I was to at this stage die, a car knocks me down, and I awaken 1,000 years later, a new avatar. And by now, Amitabh worship is no longer limited to one temple. It is now 1,00,000 temples. And someone taps me on the shoulder and says, do you think Amitabh could have been a real man? That's precisely the question that we ask ourselves about our historical and mythological figures. So I thought, wouldn't it be fascinating if you could actually craft writing which sounds so real? I've always loved fiction that sounded almost factual. And given the fact that Mr. Goswami was here, we've also now got used to the fact that on our news we have fact that sounds like fiction. There are many news channels which actually have soundtracks. So the point is there is a blurring of that distinction between fact and fiction. The way I like to think about it is that you have myth on one hand, and you have history on the other, and maybe if you can bring them closer together and find that overlap zone, then that myth and history becomes a mystery. And that's precisely what I try and do.
Cool. So it's hard to talk myth and history becoming mystery, while I'm trying to do the opposite, trying to unravel the layers to see what makes a great business and what builds these businesses today. So in my quiet, dogged pursuit of logical truth, I want to continue on my next step, having started by saying, A, dominance exists and can be got. You can be 80% dominant. B, you can do it without spending any money on advertising. I said, so it comes to 3. So what's the secret of this? And the really interesting broad thing, in some ways, it's kind of become an interesting thing to do in life is, so how do you hear about, why is it that you know Zara? Why is it you know Red Bull? Why is it you know Google? Why is it you know Facebook? And why is it that you know Twitter? And the answer to each one of this is because somebody told you. Why did somebody tell you? Somebody told you because they found it really interesting, and they thought that they'd gain some goodwill from you by telling you, right? Whether it was a journalist, or whether it was more likely just somebody else who said, yeah, you come on WhatsApp, yeah, I'm downloading, you have to get on WhatsApp. Somebody nagged you to get onto WhatsApp. Somebody told you to get onto Gmail. None of these guys actually ever did an advertising campaign. And at the core of it, the reason why somebody told you, the reason why every one of these brands was actually marketed by unknowing, unpaid evangelists, and each of them was, and that's the secret to any brand becoming great going forward, is that at the core of it, there's something remark-worthy. There's something remark-worthy about each of those products. Zara knows that it gets talked about because they change the inventory every 2 weeks. You get really frustrated when you go third time and you don't find a Zara product out there. Red Bull knows that its remark-worthiness comes from positioning itself as extra energy on the dance floor. And people get talking, hey, you know what, I'm really tired, I had a Red Bull and I can dance a little longer. Every one of these brands has something about it carefully crafted, not by accident, right? The guys at Gmail, they're not marketers, but they knew that when you were using Hotmail, you did not want just 25 MB of storage space. So one day they gave you 1 GB, and boom, they killed the market in 3 months' time. Every single guy figured out, what is this one thing that really delighted you, and not just delighted you to such an extent that you couldn't stop talking about it to somebody else. To me, that somewhere in that truth is a truth to all future product hits, at least in this next few years before something changes again. So that to me has actually become big. So I almost use that as a mantra. Remark-worthy is what you're doing. When somebody comes to me and says, hey, this is my product, this is my plan, this is my business, what is it I can do to be remark-worthy? Is it remark-worthy enough? Are people going to, tell you? The test is somebody in a bar going to tell somebody else, you got to read that book. That's how J.K. Rowling's, that's how Harry Potter went. There was no big advertising campaign. Kids just told each other, you got to read this book, right? It was entirely driven by word of mouth. So getting that word of mouth is really about being remark-worthy. And to me, that defines your life. That defines everything you do. And it's strange for us in India. We've always been brought up to conform. Arey, usko 98 mila, maths mein tumhe khali 96 mila, thappad. Right? Why can't you be like him? Oh, IIT Madras gaya, usko computer science mila, terko khali electrical mila, thappad. We've always been told to conform and be like everybody else. But the people who break out, the people who stand out, the brands who stand out, the entities that stand out are the ones that actually become big. The conformists don't. So somewhere there is the secret, I believe, to billion-dollar businesses, right? Extraordinary remark-worthiness. And that starts with the founders of the companies, or the founders of the brands, or indeed, storybooks.
Perfect.
All right, so great. So that was great. The last segment, which is the Fresh Insights. Can we have your audio interlude, please? The tabla. Fresh Insight Art. Go ahead, Ashwin.
Well, I must tell you, I've been listening to Mahesh, and the one thing that strikes me from everything that he has said is that one of the best ways of becoming a bestseller is by being a bestseller. This sounds a little almost lopsided, on its head almost. But let me take a minute to explain. When I had just had my first book published, that was 2008, and I started visiting bookstores in order to find out whether my book was available or not. And one of the young men, a salesperson from my publisher, was accompanying me, and I couldn't find my book at the main store of Crosswords in Kemp's Corner. So I went up to the store clerk, and I said, you know, I'm told that there is this really brilliant new author called Ashwin Sanghi. And would you be having his book? So he said, sir, we have 3 copies. He looked at the computer and he said, we have 3 copies. So I said, where will I find them? And then he pointed me to a corner of the bookstore. So I went there and I did find 3 copies. They had a lot of dust on them, it was evident that no one had gone in that area of the bookstore for a long, long time. That sales guy who was there with me from the publisher, he said, साहब एक चीज याद रखिए, जो दिखता है वो बिकता है. I didn't know what to do. I took out my kerchief. I wiped those 3 books very lovingly, and I took them and put them on the bestseller rack. I admitted that to Crossword many, many years later. I said, look, you know, I'm a fraud in that sense. I started out as a fraud. But it's almost counterintuitive. If you get onto Amazon and look at the bestsellers list, the reality is that the chances of something that's already on the bestseller list remaining a bestseller is that much high because of the visibility factor. And this is what it seems to be leading towards, that once you have that particular amount of critical mass, then you can just automatically attract more. So, yeah.
Yeah, so it's like being famous for being famous.
Exactly.
Because you're famous.
Exactly.
Right. Okay, Mahesh.
So I started thinking about saying, okay, I found maybe some secret of, a startup. This is how you get a great first product. This is how you become big. And I've actually applied them in my business. But I said, what happens next? How do you build a large company? How do large companies behave? How do people behave in their careers if this remarkableness is really the secret? Start looking at companies. So look at Apple. The really interesting thing is the iPhone 1, there were 3-kilometer lines along the block. It was so far ahead. The iPhone 2 was really far ahead, 2-kilometer lines around the block. The iPhone 3 was far ahead, 1-kilometer lines around the block. The iPhone 4 was almost parity product, 500-meter lines. The iPhone 5 was sub-parity. They started advertising. The iPhone 6 was sub parity. There's so much better phones than the iPhone 6. The advertising offering, EMI installments and everything. Kuch bhi kar lo, bech lo, kharid lo, right? So essentially, if you stay in one place and you lose that edge, you start losing business, you start losing the market. So how have great companies done? So that's what I found really interesting. I mean, traditionally you'd say, if I was Unilever, I made a soap, I made another soap, I sold another soap, and another soap, another soap. And then I said, I'm going to do something really big. I'm going to do a line extension. I sell a shampoo, another shampoo, another shampoo, another shampoo. Then I sell another conditioner. So I spent 30 years in soaps, shampoos, conditioners, all very close to each other because I think those are big moves. But by the time I sell soaps, somebody else has gotten into shampoos. So if I was 30% in soaps, I'll be 10% in shampoos and 3% in conditioners. But you stay close to your knitting because that's what you know. But look at companies today. Once upon a time, Unilever had the biggest brands in the world. Today, Unilever itself and its brands are not in the top 100 biggest brands in the world. The biggest brand in the world is Apple. The second biggest brand in the world is Google, right? What did Apple do, or what did Google do? Here's really what's interesting. Google started and said, okay, I'm going to do search. It won search. And it said, you know what, now I'm going to do email. No connection with search. It went and won email. After email, it said, I'm going to do maps. No connection with search, no connection with email. It went and won maps. After Maps, it said, I'm going to do social networks. It went at Google+. It lost to Facebook. He said, ठीक है, कोई बात नहीं, छोड़ो, कहीं और जाते. It went and it did mobile operating systems. It won Android. 98% of Indian phones are Android. It won it. Done. What's next? They're doing cars that drive themselves. No connection. They're going to the moon. They're putting up balloons. No connection. So essentially what Google is doing is, if the old way of saying, I'm here, my next step will be here, My next trick will be here. Google saying, this is where I am, I've won. I'll throw the seed far away, let it germinate there. I get 80% market there. That's where I'm going to be next. That's where I'm going to be somewhere else, right? And you'll see big companies tend to do that. Apple did that. You know, it won the desktop, left it, went to the laptop, won it, left it. When did music players with nanos, won it, left it. When did, you know, phones, won it, now is losing it, leaving it. Now we'll do watches, we'll do cars. So in effect, the key point is to never actually stay close to what you're doing. To go far away, reinvent yourself. If you look at the Beatles, is a great example. The way they sounded in the 67, 68, 69 is different from how they sounded in 70, 71, 72 is different from how they sounded in 70. They're completely different sounds. It's about reinventing yourself to get that 80, 90% dominant market share in some new place. And I think that's really not just a business challenge, a brand challenge, but also it's a life challenge. That's how you have to live your life. It's not about one career for 35 years, but a succession of careers where you create dominance and go do something else and go do something else. To me, that's really what, you know, long-term great success is probably going to be all about.
Amazing, absolutely amazing.